This week, we will be looking at the consumer side of the market and understanding everything related to consumer choice. In other words, every single day we are all faced with decisions all day long. Should you go to college or should you get a job? Should you get married or should you stay single? Should you go to this store or should you go to that store? In other words, every single day we make all of these decisions, and because of scarcity, it forces us to make choices. So what we will be studying in this chapter is the logic of consumer choice. Why is it that consumers choose what they do? And specifically, we will be looking at it from a market perspective. In other words, how do we take our limited income and allocate it among all the different goods and services that we could ultimately purchase? Now, in a basic sense, if you think about yourself and your likelihood of decisions that you're going to make, you realize that you basically make choices where you're trying to attain the highest level of happiness or satisfaction possible. Economists refer to this general idea of happiness or satisfaction as utility. So again, utility by definition is just a measure of the satisfaction received from possessing or consuming levels of goods and services. So other words that are sometimes used in place of utility, again, would be happiness, satisfaction, nourishment, entertainment, pride, comfort. All of these words can basically be used interchangeably, but the word we'll be using in this chapter is utility. So the idea that every time you make a choice, you are basically trying to maximize that utility, trying to get the most amount of satisfaction possible from those choices. So of course that helps us understand why we all make different choices, because what makes one person really happy may not make another person really happy. So how we maximize our utility is based on our individual tastes and preferences. Now, in economics, we like to be able to measure everything numerically. We have to have values. So again, think about if I'm talking about whether I like a cafe mocha or whether I like a cappuccino. I can just say, well, I really like a cafe mocha, but I really, really like a cappuccino, but that doesn't really give any value. You don't really have any reference to compare the two. How much more do I like one good versus the other? So we need to be able to measure the amount of utility that we get from goods and services. How much do you like it? Needs to be placed in a numeric value. So what we're going to do in this chapter is create what we call hypothetical happiness units, and we refer to those as utils. So now we can actually assign values to goods and services that we like. So again, let's say that I'm talking about, again, a cappuccino versus a cafe mocha. Instead of just saying I like one good versus the other, I can say a cappuccino gives me 10 happiness units, or 10 utils, so it gives me 10 units of satisfaction, and a cafe mocha gives me 20 units of satisfaction. So before, when I just stated I really like a cappuccino, but I really, really like a cafe mocha, you kind of got the impression that I liked a cafe mocha more, but you didn't really know for sure. Whereas now, when I'm actually assigning values, in other words, if I say a cappuccino gives me 10 happiness units and a cafe mocha gives me 20, well, now you can tell I like a cafe mocha twice as much as I like a cappuccino, because I've assigned those hypothetical happiness units. So again, although it may seem a little silly that we are now going to be assigning hypothetical satisfaction units to the goods and services we consume, you see why we have to do it, because we have to be able to measure how much we like one good versus another to understand why we choose to purchase one good over another. So So what I want to do now is walk you through an example of me consuming some level of a particular good. Let's say that I'm talking about coffee. Every morning I wake up and I have my coffee. And so I can have varying levels or varying numbers of cups of coffee in the morning. So again, let's say that I have anywhere from 1 to 4 cups of coffee this morning, and then from that I can derive how much satisfaction or how many utils I get from each individual cup of coffee. So let's say I have that first cup of coffee and it tastes very good to me, gives me my big caffeine kick of the morning. So I say that first cup of coffee gives me 50 satisfaction units. Let's say a little bit later in the morning I decide to have a second cup of coffee, and I still enjoy it. However, it's just not as good as the first. In other words, the first one gave me the most amount of satisfaction because that's what gets my morning going. So let's say I say the second cup of coffee only gives me 25 units of satisfaction. Let's say later on in the morning I decide to have a third cup of coffee, and let's say when I get to this cup of coffee I'm basically just indifferent. In other words, I didn't really get any enjoyment out of it. However, it didn't make me any worse off either. In other words, it was just, at this time I didn't really mean anything to me. Therefore, I'm going to say I didn't actually gain any additional satisfaction from drinking that third cup of coffee. I was just drinking it because it was there. And then let's say right before I leave to work, I decide there's a little more coffee in the coffee pot. I'm going to go ahead and have that fourth cup of coffee. However, once I start drinking that, I start to feel jittery and nauseous. So I actually do I not only not get any more satisfaction from getting it, it actually makes me dissatisfied because it, makes me not feel good. So at this point, I would say that it gave me negative 10 units of satisfaction. What I can do now is add up all of that individual utility to see what my total utility from the consumption of that good would be. So again, if I only have 1 cup of coffee, then that means the total amount of utility that I would get from coffee consumption in the morning would be 50 satisfaction units, 50 utils. If I decided to have 2 cups of coffee, then my total amount of utility would be the 50 from the first and then the 25 from the second. So I would end up having 75 units of satisfaction. If I decided to have that third cup of coffee, again, I didn't gain any utility, but I didn't lose any either, so I just had 0. So I would stay at 75. And then if I decided to choke down that fourth cup of coffee, we know that actually made me feel nauseous. So that took away from my total utility because it gave me 10 units of dissatisfaction. So then my total utility would drop down to 65. So what we see here is I can derive the total amount of utility that I derive from consuming some, number of units of a good simply by adding up the individual utility that I get from each individual unit of that good. So again, what we refer to this as is the total utility from consuming some quantity of a good or service. And then the individual utility that we get from consuming each individual unit is what we call marginal utility, the incremental amounts of utility that we get when we consume some unit of a good or service. Additionally, notice that as I continued to consume the coffee, the amount of additional utility that I was getting was declining. In other words, as I consumed, going from 1 cup to 2 cups to 3 cups to 4 cups, the amount of utils per unit of that good was getting smaller. We refer to that as what we call diminishing marginal utility. Diminishing marginal utility is simply the concept that as you continue to consume incremental amounts of a good or service in some specified period of time, the amount of additional utility you will get will continue to decline. And then the last concept that we need to understand is that if you continue to consume incremental units of a good or service in a specified period of time, at some point the amount of utility that you derive will actually be negative. So that's what we refer to as disutility. Disutility is once you are getting dissatisfaction from consuming a good or service. So let's go ahead and summarize the 4 concepts or 4 terms that we need to understand related to utility. So again, the individual utility that we get from from consuming some good or service, the incremental amounts, we refer to as marginal utility. And of course, the formal definition for how you calculate marginal utility would just be taking the change in the total utility divided by the change in the quantity of that good. If you want to know what the total utility is for a good or service, you just add up all of the marginal utility. So it's just a measure of the total satisfaction derived from consuming a quantity of some good or service. We also want to make sure we understand the concept of diminishing marginal utility. So again, all that means is that the more of a good or service that we continue to consume in a specified period of time, the less is the additional utility that we get from that good or service. And then the last concept we need to understand is just disutility, the idea that at some point you will actually get dissatisfaction by continuing to consume some good or service. So here I give a hypothetical example of the utility that I'm going to get if I listen to consecutive hours of music during the day. So again, what we see here is that I can listen to anywhere from 1 to 7 hours of music, and each hour that I listen to the music, I'm going to have a different amount of marginal utility. You notice that the first hour of music gives me 200 utils, but the second hour only gives me 98, the third hour gives me 50, the fourth hour gives me 10, so on and so forth. So we see that principle of diminishing marginal utility taking place until the sixth unit, where if I continue to listen to music into 6 hours, then I actually get dissatisfaction from continuing to listen to the music. And then of course, in order to derive my total utility, all I did was add up the individual marginal utility that I was getting. So again, we can easily see how we calculate marginal versus total utility. If I said, what is the total utility of 4 hours of music, all I would do is add up the individual utility. So I get 200 from the first hour, 98 from the second hour, 50 from the third hour, and 10 from the fourth hour. So when I add all of that up, I come up with 350 utils. So that would be how I calculate the total utility. Whereas if I want to calculate the marginal utility for 4 hours of music, then I'm going to take the change in the total utility. So I went from 348 to 358, which is 10. And of course, we have to divide that by the change in the number of units. So I went from 3 hours of music to 4 hours of music. So 4 minus 3 is 1. So 10 divided by 1 equals 10. Therefore, the marginal utility of 4 hours of music is simply 10. And of course, that's what we see right here. And then that's what we see right here. I just want to make sure you understand how you calculate those numbers. If we're calculating total utility, we simply add up all of the marginal utility. If we're calculating marginal utility, we take the change in the total utility and divide it by the change in the number of units. So that way we can come up with those numbers. And just like everything else in economics, we can then graph this data. So I can ask you to graph your total utility curve and your marginal utility curve. And of course, that's what we see right over here on the left-hand side of the slides. Notice that your total utility curve will always be increasing until marginal utility equals 0. In other words, once marginal utility equals 0, because of the law of diminishing marginal utility, after 0, that means we have to be going into the negative. We're going into disutility, which means at that point, total utility will start to decline, because now we'll be taking away from our total utility of consuming that good, because our marginal utility has become negative. So again, notice that our total utility curve just continues to climb, and then it peaks out where marginal utility equals 0, and then it starts to decline after that. Whereas our marginal utility, after that first unit consumed, that curve will just constantly go down because of the principle of diminishing diminishing marginal utility. As you consume more and more, each additional unit that you consume brings you less and less satisfaction. So again, the shapes of your total and marginal utility curves, regardless of what good we're talking about, should look something like this. Now, if we're trying to figure out where we maximize the amount of utility, notice that because after marginal utility reaches zero, we go into disutility. That means that total utility can never increase any more after that. Therefore, anytime we want to maximize the total amount of satisfaction that we get from consuming a good, we're always going to want to consume to the point that marginal utility equals zero. In other words, there's no other level of consumption that will bring us a greater level of satisfaction. Now, some points to remember about utility before we move into the next section of the chapter. Usually, the shorter the period of time, the more quickly marginal utility is going to diminish. So think of my music example. If I listen to 5 hours of music straight in the car, it makes sense that my utility is going to diminish rather quickly. I'm going to get sick of listening to the same songs over and over and over again. However, let's say I'm talking about listening to 5 hours of music over an entire week. So maybe I'm only listening to 1 hour of music a day. Well, then I'm not going to get as sick of the music as quickly. So my utility is not going to diminish as quickly. So again, the shorter the period of time, the more quickly your satisfaction is going to diminish. Another thing we want to remember is that although we're going to be assigning hypothetical satisfaction units to goods and services in this chapter for example purposes, we know in the real world that we are not all identical. So just because I say a cup of coffee gives me 50 utils, that doesn't mean that it gives everybody 50 utils, because consumers are not identical. Maybe some people hate coffee, so they would drink that first cup of coffee and they would immediately go into disutility. So we each maintain our own levels of satisfaction that we derive from consuming goods and services. We want to remember that although we're assigning hypothetical satisfaction units to goods in this chapter, they're not universal and they don't apply to everybody the same. And then the third point I have here, businesses will set prices that yield profits from the average customer. We won't get into that too much because we're still going to be focusing on the logic of consumer choice opposed to profits of the business.